Humans are one of the two animals, along with hyenas, capable of killing other animals solely for the pleasure of it, not just for sustenance. This is the root of what Rousseau referred to as human cruelty, the inherent malevolence of humans who take pleasure in inflicting suffering on others. Throughout history, there have been numerous methods devised by human ingenuity to make people's lives increasingly terrible, tortures and execution methods that push the boundaries of horror. There are debates about what the most brutal forms of torture and execution in history are. However, while navigating the deep web, as always, you can find the most blatant examples of what human cruelty can be. There's also the extensive imagination of those who write numerous legends and stories that circulate on the deep web, devoid of any source and therefore entirely unverifiable, whether they are fantasies or dark realities that happened somewhere in the world. Often, stories are told of the so-called most extreme forms of torture, ones that not even the Guantanamo court would apply, forms of torture that consider human rights mere words. But there is one in particular, so cruel that it cannot be surpassed by any other. And the reason is very simple, because it encompasses all the other forms of torture we know. It has no name, and it doesn't even have a well-defined space-time location. The story that is told more or less in the same way goes something like this. It's not clear where or when it happens. Simply in a sterile room with neon lights and a floor wet from running water, a man is dragged inside. It's not clear exactly who this man is. There are various legends and theories about his origin, about what his story might be, but it's never very clear, and there are numerous facts and interpretations regarding it that can be explored perhaps in another video. The man is dragged in completely naked, and he is hung by his wrists on a hook hanging from the ceiling. In turn, the nameless tormentor, who does not speak, simply wears a mask, depending on the versions. It can be a hockey mask, a plastic mask, or a wooden mask with two holes drawn, or the mask of a skull. He drags him, hangs him, and then announces with a very sadistic tone that what he is about to do every single day will be to execute a different torture, each day more painful, more severe, until reaching the final judgment. It's not even clear what this man has done to deserve such treatment, and it's not even clear what kind of mental illness this terrible killer has that brings him so much pleasure in carrying out the judgment and laughing. On the first day, the killer tears out his hair, but not with a normal razor, with one of those sheep-shearing razors, and then does the same for the body hair and beard. In that case, he uses a regular razor, but uses it so poorly that it leaves a lot of scars on the face. After that, he proceeds to give him a sort of waxing with a particularly adhesive wax that is spread all over his body and then ripped off. In this way, the man is left completely hairless and already covered in the first wounds. Then, the killer starts having fun, takes a whip with his right hand, dips it in water, and then sprays it with a touch of alcohol, then dips it in salt, and then whips it all over the body, especially the face, for 2 hours straight, to prevent him from bleeding to death from the wounds. The same mixture of water, alcohol, and salt is spread. The burning is so intense that the man collapses, but we have only grazed the surface of his skin. The serial killer is nothing but feverish. All he can do is repeat how much he wishes to unleash himself now, to do all the tortures now, and yet he has to hold back and do them one after the other, day after day. For him, it's an almost unbearable weight. He should unleash himself right now. On the second day, the punishments become slightly more intimate. His fingernails are torn out one by one, and then a Texan centipede of the type with a very stinging red head is inserted into each ear and one into the anal opening. Afterward, he is immersed in a tub full of jellyfish, not the lethal kind, the small pink ones found in the common Mediterranean seas, and stung by numerous wasps. He is subjected to electroshock and the excruciating wheel. He spends time on a chair covered in nails, handcuffed, and then gloves used in some aboriginal rituals are sewn onto his hands. The gloves are full of stinging ants. The ritual involves wearing these ant-filled gloves around his hands for several days. The pain can be excruciating, but it's the test that Aboriginals go through to become men. On the third day, his fingertips were amputated one by one, and then phalanx by phalanx. His hands and feet were left fingerless. The fourth day, his hands and feet were cut off, and they were stapled back on. The fifth day, long cuts were made on both his arms and legs, precisely on the forearms and the lower parts of his legs, tearing through the flesh. He was then tied to a wheel, fitting into the hollows of his arms and legs. The wheel continuously turned, and from it, the bones of his forearms and legs were shattered before being cut at the elbows and knees. The process was repeated, and in the end, only a torso and a head remained. Throughout all of this, he was still alive. The killer took care to ensure that he didn't bleed too much, disinfecting the wounds and maintaining him in a state of nutrition and conditions sufficient to keep him alive and conscious. He had to feel all the pain. His penis was the next victim. It was first flogged, then immersed in boiling oil, then burned, then frozen, and finally, of course, it was severed. The same fate befell his testicles. An opening similar to a womb was dug into him, and this in turn was filled with rusty barbed wire, nettles, and stinging powder, and clumsily stitched up. The same fate also befell the anal orifice. Then it was his intestines' turn. His belly was split open with a large knife, and his intestines were slowly uncoiled, forcing him to eat them. When the intestines reappeared, he made him eat them again, and this continued until, after vomiting for the 16th time, he simply chose to refill his intestines with barbed wire and had them closed, sewing them all back up. Next, his mouth was sewn shut forever, and his abdomen was closed, stitching it up as well, but leaving inside a huge quantity of needles soaked in alcohol. His stomach was next. First, it was filled with all kinds of acidic, spicy, alcoholic, and burning substances to increase the stomach's pH, which ended up digesting itself, opening up, and its contents spilled throughout the rest of the body, causing immense burning sensations to the victim. Even the stomach was replaced with a tangle of barbed wire. One of his 2 kidneys was tortured, shredded, penetrated, then removed and replaced with another cocoon, and the same for the right one. To prevent him from dying, his blood was artificially filtered from this point onwards. Finally, he was forced to breathe a series of nerve gases into his lungs that caused immense chest pain, were highly damaging to metabolism, and neurotoxic, causing him unspeakable agony. His lungs were then slowly filled with water to make him feel the excruciating pain of drowning, a pain he couldn't express with death because there were artificial respiratory systems keeping him alive. Those artificial respiratory systems were steel lungs. At this point, his lungs were filled with acid and barbed wire, punctured, tortured, mangled, mutilated, and then removed, and everything was sewn up. Then it was the heart's turn. First, an artificial heart was implanted to perform the organ's function while the original heart was tortured. Then, a small pacemaker was implanted on the original heart, capable of regulating cardiac activity on command, subjecting him to numerous heart attacks, precisely 32. Heart attacks are one of the most painful experiences one can endure, alongside childbirth and cluster headaches. Finally, the heart was repeatedly stabbed, filled with needles, immersed in acid, punctured, torn, and then removed and burned. Only a skin and bone shell remained in this victim's torso. The skin was then torn away, fully exposing him. Everything inside, such as barbed wire, was emptied. One by one, the vertebrae were shattered, causing the progressive loss of sensation in higher and higher areas of the body. The pelvis was shattered, and the muscles were slowly shredded and butchered, not with surgical instruments, but with slaughterhouse tools like cleavers. as if he were a pig. He was now only a head and spine, with a few muscles and patches of tissue still obediently hanging from the body. One by one, the vertebrae were removed, and he lost control of higher and higher portions of the body, eventually becoming a severed head, still capable of suffering and nourished through tubes. The head was whipped and tortured for several days, after which the mouth was reopened, and one by one, the teeth were drilled to the gums. Then the tongue was tortured and cut, and the gums were drilled with nails in place of teeth. The mouth was filled with barbed wire and the usual items, and this time, it was sewn shut forever, and he was fed intravenously. The eyes were first tortured with needles, then drilled with thin drills for several days, removed, and replaced with a cluster of needles and barbed wire, and then sewn shut. The nasal septum was broken open, cut, and drilled with a drill. His ears were pierced, and the eardrums were completely shattered. The outer ear was filled with piercings and cut piece by piece. And finally, the auditory canal was filled with barbed wire and sewn shut. Then, one by one, all 12 cranial nerves were severed, depriving him of all 5 senses. His jaw was split and removed, and then his craniofacial skeleton was shattered, leaving only the cranial box. The skull was opened with a circular saw and removed, and the brain was further tortured. Now it was senseless, lost in its thoughts in terror and pain. His brain was then connected to a computer, forced to live in a kind of virtual reality where every year in the computer equated to a second in real life. If he fell asleep, the dream would last for 10 years, but in the computer, it was only a year in reality. 1 second on multiple levels. After enduring 10 years of mental torture, this led him to exist in an eternal infernal limbo, where every torment, every possible vision, was inserted by the computer into his brain. They made him experience any form of pain, any form of torture for years, for centuries, for millennia. His perception of time was completely distorted. Slowly, pieces of his brain were removed, every single lobe responsible for every single function, the one for balance, the one for the senses, until he was only capable of suffering and experiencing the horrible memories that now haunted his mind. Then, the Olympic lobe, responsible for memory along with the thalamus, was also removed, leaving him terrified and identityless, without memories, suffering endlessly without knowing why and how. His perception of time was now completely eternalized. As time passed, new pieces of his brain were taken, and it had become a mushy mass of brain without memory, without senses, without identity, without the ability to reason. He could only feel eternal pure pain. After this eternity, his consciousness was finally transferred to the computer, while his brain was destroyed by electroshock. Sizzling. There, the tortures continued. He lived in a kind of video game, and the game was published online, called Torture the Men. People from all over the world connected and tortured him, thinking he was just a character in the game, devoid of emotions, devoid of identity, and they killed him. Every character in every video game, through a mysterious hacking, was him. He was every character killed in the game's history. He was there every time, living every single suffering recorded in every computer when he died, and his brain associated all of this with the image, with the pain. Everyone enjoyed playing, and he experienced those deaths one by one, from the sadistic to the quickest. But then the game became boring, and everyone uninstalled it, banned it, deleted it, removed it from websites, reported it. Site after site, computer after computer, was removed, and he died every time, felt erased every time, until he was reduced to just one computer, his original computer, where he existed in every file. Still, every file was slowly deleted one after another. The computer was eventually completely formatted, and he experienced yet another death. But some bits of his soul were saved on a cassette that circulated for a long time. Those who saw it could witness a few frames of so much suffering and experience a kind of psychological transfer to the victim, to feel like him, to become like him. Some even claimed that watching that cassette led to suicide after a certain number of days, not before making copies of the cassette and distributing them in a macabre chain. The cassette itself was pursued. Several copies were destroyed. People were afraid, and the myth of the cursed cassette was born. Only one remained, last seen 3 years ago. After that, everything was converted into a Word document that told this immense story of suffering in the smallest details, in every single day, in every single version, in every single moment. It spread in a very ironic way on the internet again, and it went viral. Many added more tortures, more killings. It became a kind of sport. They expanded the story of torture, added new killings, new versions that the poor victim experienced in a sense. A website connected to all these copies, compiling in one text all the tortures that grew day by day. However, even this document was later deleted from all computers and websites. It's said to have contained a programming virus in its matrix. When only one remained, it was printed into a book that narrated his story. According to some, this book inspired the worst serial killers, both ancient and recent. Of course, in recent times, each serial killer, in turn, added new details, new stories to this large book that had already seen too much suffering. And here, the story becomes nebulous and vague. It's unclear what happened, new versions, new variations, and everything is unclear. According to some, the book itself was persecuted and ultimately burned. According to others, there are still some copies. According to yet others, the book's text inspired certain satanic music groups whose records then spread. According to some, this book inspired video games like Sad Satan, and many others. The legends themselves multiply further, and the ending of this story, in fact, does not exist. We don't know what's true, what's false. The moral of the story would be that, in a sense, men continued to live in that video game, in that audio file, in that video file, in that text document. He existed as a sort of program, the one that spread him, that continued to preserve those memories, those tortures. This was undoubtedly a man who had seen hell, if it exists, according to others. However, this is not just one story. It's a collection of many stories, many events, perhaps with a common thread, or perhaps simply gathered together. What's concerning is that this story, much like the human centipede, is scientifically plausible. What's described, the forms of torture, keeping him alive, slowly killing him piece by piece, influencing the brain with spikes, is not science fiction, at least not anymore. It would be very unsettling to know that, in a sense, every time someone was killed in a video game or a movie, someone, somewhere, suffered deeply. It would be very worrisome to know the resentment this person holds against humanity and to hope that they don't seek some form of revenge and replay the game, this time by their rules. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel for more creepypastas. Until the next one.